I knew something was wrong before I even pulled into the driveway. Maybe it was the way the pasture looked from the county road. Maybe it was that strange, empty feeling you get when your brain notices something missing before your eyes catch up. Either way, the second I topped the little rise overlooking my property, my stomach dropped. My fence was gone. Not damaged. Not leaning. Gone. The entire stretch along the east pasture had been ripped out of the ground like it had never existed. Fence posts lay scattered across the grass, rails stacked in crooked piles, chunks of dirt torn up everywhere. For a second, I just sat there in my truck staring through the windshield, hoping I was somehow looking at the wrong section of land. Then reality settled in. I threw the truck into park and climbed out. The first thing I checked wasn't the fence. It was my horses. Anybody who's owned animals long enough knows exactly what I mean. Property can be fixed. A loose horse on a highway can ruin lives. My heart was pounding as I jogged toward the corral, but somehow every horse was still inside, calm as ever, looking at me like I was the crazy one. I stood there for a minute, resting my hands on the gate, trying to slow my breathing. Then I turned back toward the destroyed fence line. That's when I noticed the notice. Somebody had stapled a laminated HOA violation sheet onto one of the broken posts. It flapped in the afternoon breeze like a bad joke. I pulled it loose and read it twice because the first time didn't make any sense. Fence does not comply with community aesthetic standards. Community standards. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know what else to do. See, I wasn't part of any HOA. Never had been. My property sat outside the gated community that bordered my land. I owned 78 acres of pasture, woods, and creek bottom. They owned expensive houses, golf carts, decorative mailboxes, and a long list of rules nobody could possibly remember. We had always existed next to each other, but we were never the same thing. My side smelled like hay, diesel fuel, and horses. Their side smelled like fresh mulch and homeowner meetings. Standing there holding that laminated notice, I realized somebody over there had decided those differences bothered them. I spent the next hour walking the damage. The fence wasn't just old wood thrown together by some weekend hobbyist. My father and I had built most of it years earlier. Every post had been set by hand. Every section followed the property line exactly. Whoever removed it didn't care about any of that. They brought equipment. Heavy equipment. Deep tire tracks cut across the pasture where machines had rolled through. They didn't ask permission. They didn't leave a note. They didn't even have the decency to knock on my door first. They simply showed up and treated my property like it belonged to them. The more I looked, the angrier I got. Not loud anger. Not shouting anger. The kind that settles deep in your chest and gets quieter the longer it stays there. That evening, my neighbor Hank drove over after spotting the damage from the road. Hank had lived nearby longer than almost anybody. He climbed out of his truck, stared at the mess for a few seconds, then shook his head. "Let me guess," he said. "The folks behind the gate?" I nodded. He let out a slow whistle. "Well, that's a new level of stupid." We stood there talking until sunset painted the pasture gold. Hank told me he'd heard complaints from some residents about my fence blocking views from their walking trail. Apparently, a few people wanted better photos of sunsets and open fields. Better views. Imagine tearing down somebody else's property because you wanted a prettier evening walk. By the time Hank left, I had made up my mind about one thing. I wasn't rebuilding a single board until I knew exactly who ordered it. The next morning, I followed the tire tracks across the pasture until they reached the service road leading toward a local contractor's equipment yard. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for answers. What I found instead was the first clue that this situation was about to become a whole lot bigger than a fence. Because the contractor didn't deny anything. In fact, he looked surprised I was even asking questions. He casually admitted his crew had been hired by the HOA president herself, a woman named Evelyn Cross, and according to him, the board believed they had every right to remove the fence. Then he said something I'll never forget. He shrugged and told me, "They figured you'd just build another one." I remember standing there staring at him, hearing those words echo around in my head. They figured I'd just build another one. That was the moment I stopped thinking about the fence itself and started thinking about something far more important, something the HOA board had completely forgotten about over the years, something sitting quietly on my land that their entire community depended on every single day. Most people driving past my property would never notice it. The building sat about half a mile from the house near a grove of old cottonwoods, A plain metal pump house no bigger than a garden shed, faded gray paint, rusty hinges, nothing that would ever catch your attention. But what sat inside that little building mattered more to the people living behind those decorative stone entrance signs than all their board meetings, bylaws, and community newsletters combined. As I drove home from the contractor's yard that morning, memories kept coming back to me. My father, Walter Dawson, used to tell stories about the early days before the subdivision existed. Back then, the land where those expensive homes now stood was mostly open ranch ground owned by a development company trying to turn countryside into luxury living. The biggest problem they faced wasn't roads or permits. It was water. The underground wells they drilled weren't producing enough clean water to support the clubhouse they planned to build. My father had a well that did. A strong one. Reliable. The kind that kept running through dry summers when neighboring properties struggled. According to Dad, one of the developers came over personally. They sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee and worked out a simple agreement. The new development could draw water from our well, and in exchange we'd have access through their paved entrance road whenever we needed it. No lawyers, no contracts, no easements filed with the county. Just a handshake and mutual respect. Back then, people still believed their word meant something. The men who made that agreement were long gone now. Dad passed away years earlier. The original developer sold the project. New management came in, then new board members. Eventually, people forgot how certain things worked. The water kept flowing. Nobody asked questions. Nobody remembered where it came from. Until now. I spent that afternoon digging through old records in the barn office. Property maps, utility notes, tax files, my father's handwritten journals. Everything confirmed what I already suspected. The pump house sat entirely on my property. The well belonged entirely to me. There was no legal document requiring me to provide water. Nothing. By sunset, I had all the answers I needed. The next morning, I grabbed a thermos of coffee and walked down to the pump house just after sunrise. The air smelled like fresh grass and damp earth. Birds were chirping in the trees. It felt like any ordinary morning except for the fact that I was about to change the course of somebody else's summer. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar hum of equipment filled the room. Pipes ran along the walls. Pressure gauges ticked quietly. The main supply valve sat exactly where it always had. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. Contrary to what some people might think, I wasn't smiling. I wasn't looking for revenge. Truthfully, I was disappointed. Maybe that's what bothered me most. If someone from the HOA had simply come to my door and talked to me like a human being, none of what followed would have happened. Instead, they chose arrogance. They chose entitlement. They chose bulldozers. I reached over and slowly turned the valve closed. The sound inside the room changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Then I locked the building and walked away. By lunchtime, the first signs appeared. A maintenance worker from the clubhouse drove around inspecting equipment. That evening, pool circulation systems began struggling. By the next morning, things got interesting. The subdivision revolved around its country club. People there loved that pool. It wasn't just a swimming pool. It was the centerpiece of community life. Birthday parties, summer events, family gatherings, weekend cookouts. The place practically served as their town square. Without fresh water feeding the system properly, the filters started losing the battle. The water became slightly cloudy, then noticeably cloudy. By day 3, residents began posting photos online. Parents complained. Guests asked questions. One woman posted that the pool looked like somebody had poured green paint into it overnight. Another resident blamed poor maintenance. Someone else accused the board of hiding information. I may or may not have enjoyed reading those comments with my morning coffee. Around noon that same day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the clubhouse office. I let it ring. Then it rang again. And again. Finally, I answered. A nervous manager introduced himself and explained there appeared to be a water supply issue. "We're trying to figure out what's happening," he said. "Have you noticed anything unusual?" I almost laughed. "Actually," I said, "I've noticed my fence is missing." Silence. Long silence. Then he cleared his throat and ended the call shortly afterward. 2 days later, there was a knock on my front door. Standing outside were 3 board members and HOA President Evelyn Cross herself. She was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to run a place like that. Perfect clothes. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from spending years getting your way. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Dawson," she said, We need you to restore water service immediately. Not hello. Not sorry. Not let's discuss what happened. Just a demand. I leaned against the doorway and folded my arms. That's interesting, I said. Because I need my fence restored immediately. Her smile tightened. The fence was determined to be a visual issue affecting community property values. Community property values? I repeated. You tore down private property on land you don't own. One of the board members jumped in. We can discuss that separately. I shook my head. No, that's exactly what we're discussing. Then I handed Evelyn an envelope. Inside were estimates for rebuilding the fence, repairing damaged pasture sections, replacing gates, labor costs, and something else I'd spent several evenings calculating. Historical water usage fees. 20 years worth. Not because I expected to collect 20 years of back payments, but because I wanted them to understand the value of what they'd taken for granted. She looked through the paperwork, then laughed. Actually laughed. This is ridiculous, she said. We'll have our attorneys review it. Please do, I replied. I look forward to hearing what they think about unauthorized demolition on private property. Her expression changed for the first time. Just slightly. A crack in the armor. Then they left. The following week turned into absolute chaos for the HOA. The pool officially closed. Summer programs were canceled. Birthday reservations disappeared. Community events were postponed indefinitely. Residents became furious. Rumors spread faster than facts. Every few days, water trucks arrived, trying to compensate for the shortage. Massive tanker trucks rolled through the entrance gates while residents watched from sidewalks. The board spent thousands and still couldn't solve the problem. Without consistent supply, filtration systems struggled. Chemical balances became unstable. The beautiful blue water slowly transformed into something that looked more at home in a swamp than a luxury neighborhood. Then landscaping started suffering. Decorative flower beds wilted. Sections of grass browned under the summer sun. Complaints multiplied. One evening, Hank stopped by again carrying a six-pack. We sat on my porch watching the sunset while he laughed at another story he'd heard from a resident. Apparently, someone had demanded a special emergency meeting because they believed the board was covering up environmental contamination. People always imagine the wildest explanations, Hank said. I nodded. Most people never consider the simple one. What's that? He asked. Actions have consequences. About 2 weeks after the valve was closed, the tone of communication changed dramatically. Gone were the demands. Gone were the threats. Gone were the legal warnings. Suddenly, every message sounded polite. Respectful. Urgent, but respectful. One evening, I received a call from a different board member named Richard Talbot. Unlike Evelyn, Richard sounded exhausted. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Really talk. That was the moment I knew something important had happened inside the HOA. The residents were no longer pressuring me. They were pressuring their own leadership. And for the first time since this entire mess began, the board wasn't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive. Richard came over the following afternoon. No entourage. No board members. No HOA attorney trying to sound important. Just one tired-looking man carrying a folder and wearing the expression of someone who hadn't slept much in days. We sat at the same picnic table behind my house where my father and I used to drink coffee after long days repairing fences. For a while, neither of us said much. The wind moved through the pasture, the horses grazed in the distance, and somewhere near the creek a hawk cried out. Finally, Richard opened the folder. I think we made a mistake, he said. I raised an eyebrow. A mistake? He sighed. A very expensive mistake. Over the next hour, he told me what had been happening inside the community. Residents were furious. Event cancellations had cost money. Membership complaints were piling up. Refund requests were arriving daily. The landscaping budget had exploded because of emergency water deliveries. Board meetings had turned into shouting matches. People who once praised Evelyn Cross were openly demanding her resignation. The board had finally consulted outside attorneys, and those attorneys apparently delivered some news nobody wanted to hear. The HOA had no authority over my property. None. The fence removal exposed them to significant liability. And the water issue? The lawyers discovered exactly what I already knew. There was no recorded agreement requiring me to provide access to the well. The arrangement had existed entirely on goodwill. The same goodwill they'd bulldozed. Richard rubbed his forehead. The board wants to settle. I'm listening, I said. He slid several documents across the table. The offer was comprehensive. full fence reconstruction, brand new gates, compensation for every documented property damage expense, legal fees, survey costs, everything. Then came the part that really mattered. A 20-year water access lease drafted by actual attorneys this time, with annual adjustments, maintenance obligations, liability protections, and one very important detail. Payment up front. A substantial payment. The kind that made it clear they finally understood the value of reliable water. I sat there quietly reading every page while Richard watched. The funny thing was, by then it wasn't really about money anymore. Sure, the compensation mattered. But what bothered me most from the beginning wasn't the destroyed fence. It was the attitude behind it. The belief that because they had a board, a budget, and a gated entrance, they could simply decide what happened on someone else's land. After I finished reading, I looked up. I have one condition. Richard immediately nodded. Name it. Any future structure, landscaping project, trail expansion, fence modification, utility installation, or visual improvement that affects the property line between us gets my written approval first. He didn't even hesitate. Done. I almost laughed. 3 weeks earlier they acted like I didn't exist. Now they were agreeing before I finished the sentence. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Crews arrived and rebuilt the fence exactly where it belonged. Honestly, they built it better than the original. New posts, stronger rails, reinforced gates. They repaired the pasture damage and reseeded the torn-up sections of ground. The water agreement was signed. Funds were transferred. Then one quiet Tuesday morning, I walked back to the little pump house beneath the cottonwoods. The same morning sunlight filtered through the trees. The same equipment hummed softly inside. I stood there for a moment remembering everything that had happened over the previous month. Then I reached down and slowly opened the valve. Water began flowing once again toward the subdivision, toward the clubhouse, toward the swimming pool that had become the most expensive mud pit in county history. A few days later, the water trucks disappeared. The filtration systems recovered. The pool slowly returned to normal. Summer activities resumed. Life moved on, at least mostly. Not long afterward, Evelyn Cross resigned as HOA president. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, well, let's just say public opinion inside that neighborhood had shifted dramatically. Richard eventually became board president, and surprisingly, we got along pretty well. He understood something his predecessor never did. Cooperation is a lot cheaper than conflict. Months later, I was repairing a section of fence near the road when a resident from the subdivision stopped his golf cart and struck up a conversation. We talked for a few minutes, and before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. You know, he said, a lot of people over there still think shutting off the water was extreme. I smiled and leaned against the fence post. Maybe it was. He laughed. Do you regret it? I looked across the pasture toward the rebuilt fence stretching along the property line. Beyond it sat the neighborhood, neat and organized, looking exactly the way it always had. Then I looked at my horses grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. No, I said honestly. I regret that it became necessary. He nodded thoughtfully before driving away. And every now and then, especially during summer, I'll catch myself looking toward that country club pool. Bright blue water, families laughing, kids splashing around, everything working exactly the way it should. And I can't help remembering how close it all came to falling apart because a handful of people confused authority with ownership. The truth is, fences can be rebuilt, contracts can be signed, money can change hands, but trust is harder to repair. Once somebody decides your property rights don't matter, once they convince themselves the rules apply differently to them than everyone else, they're already headed toward trouble. In the end, the pool was never really the story. The fence wasn't either. The real story was what happens when arrogance collides with consequences. One side believed power came from titles, committees, and official-looking notices. The other side simply owned the land beneath their feet. So now I'm curious what you think. Was shutting off the water a fair response after they destroyed private property, or did I go too far? If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently, or would you have done exactly the same thing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because these kinds of neighbor and HOA disputes always spark strong opinions. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought they could tell you what to do on your own property, share your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-world property battles, community conflicts, and stories where actions end up having consequences nobody saw coming.